Before we start our in-depth look at the different Angular objects and the right ways to deal with them, let's first discuss minification. Minification is the process of rewriting your JavaScript so that it is as small as it can possibly be. There are two main methods for this. The first is removing all unnecessary whitespace, and the second is to rename variables and parameters to short names. Since JavaScript is shipped over the wire, reducing the size of it can help make our web applications respond faster. Additionally, minifying code will obscure its purpose, so you can use this as a way of protecting your intellectual property. It's worth mentioning that Angular is already really small in comparison with writing the same functionality without a good MVC framework. In fact, compared to writing the same functionality in jQuery, you can expect your Angular code to be as much as 80% smaller. But there is still a benefit to minifying your code, since it will be smaller still. The result of a minification process should be a JavaScript file that executes exactly like it did before minification. Unfortunately, with Angular, there is a problem here. Angular uses reflection to look at parameter names of certain functions, like controllers and services, so that its dependency injector can provide the correct dependency. So let's take a look at how code actually gets minified. I have here a very simple Angular application. Again, I'm putting all the code in one file for simplicity. In this particular application, I've got one module called app. I've got one service I'm creating right here that I've called my service, and it simply returns a simple object that has one value that says I'm a service. Then I've got a single controller right here named controller1. This controller takes in two dependencies, the scope and the mySVC service right here. It takes the mySVC service, it grabs its val value, and assigns it to the scope's val property. If we look in the HTML, we can see that we're using that controller and binding to the val value. This application is very simple, but it works just fine. Let's run this in the browser and show the result. So here we've got our application, simply printing out I'm a service. Now, let's talk about how minification works. What a minifier will do is go through and remove all the white space, which I won't do, but it will also mangle the names of any variables and parameters. So in our case, what it's going to do is take these two parameter names, scope and mySVC, and replace them with very small parameter names. Now that it's done that, it will go through and take any usages of those variables and replace them as well. So it would rename them here and down in here. Now structurally, this JavaScript is exactly identical to what it used to be before. Unfortunately, Angular will no longer know what A and B are since they're not named correctly. Let's save that and run it in the browser and see what we get. Now you can see that our binding is no longer happening, and if we look at the console, we can see that we're getting an error. Now thankfully, Angular has a way to deal with this, and it's called min-safing the code. Let's go ahead and min-safe our code and see how it works. The way we do this is to come up here and replace this function with an array. This array is going to have several parameters, one each for each of the parameters to the function, and then its final parameter will be the function itself. So you can see that what I've done is specify those two parameter names, but as strings. And since a minifier won't mess with strings, Angular can now determine what those parameters are supposed to be. We'll go down here and finish this off, and then rerun this in the browser. And now we're back to a working state. Now let's talk about ngmin. ngmin is a utility that will go through and take your unmin-safed Angular code and min-safe it for you so that you don't have to do it yourself. This way you can author your Angular code without worrying about the additional ceremony of min-safing it, and then just run your code through ngmin before you run it through your minifier. Let's take a look at what ngmin will actually do. So I'm going to unmin-safe this code. And now that I've got those set back, I'm going to run this through ngmin. Now, ngmin is just a little node utility. So if you don't already have it installed, but you do have node installed, all you have to do from the command line is run npm install ngmin, and then it's a good idea to install it globally, so put on a -g, and then that will install ngmin for you. Now I've already got it installed, so I'm just going to run ngmin, and then the input file name, and the output file name. Now let's go back to our WebStorm and see what the result of that was. Okay, looking at the appsafe.js file, we can see that it basically did exactly what we did before. It goes into our controller, it takes the function and replaces it with the array, adds in the two parameters, and then the function itself. Now, once we run this through a minifier, when those things get changed, they're going to work just fine. So there's actually a nice little online minifier that we can use and show you how this still works after ngmin has been run, even when it runs through the minifier. but this way we can use an actual real minifier instead of me just doing it by hand. So I'll copy the code out, and I'll come over here to this online minifier, paste the code in there, run it, and then here is the result of that. So let's put it back into our file, and let's just take a really quick glance at this. So I'll scroll over to the right here, and here's my MinSafe controller, and you can see that it did exactly the kind of minification that I did by hand. So let's save this, and let's change our index so that it uses that file instead. And then let's go back to our browser and refresh it, and it's still working just fine. So now, even though the code has been minified, Angular is still able to run just fine. So now let's go back to our code, and I want to show you one more thing about ngmin. It looks like ngmin's awesome and can do everything you need it to do, but there are actually some situations you can get into where ngmin will miss places that it needs to min-safe your code. I'm going to show you an example of this. You can see that when we declare a controller, it takes two parameters. First is the name of the controller, and second is the function that represents the controller. Well, this function doesn't have to be an inline function. So let's take this function and move it out, and move it up here. And we'll turn this into a named function called controller1. And I'm going to go down into my declaration of my controller and put a reference to that function in there. Now if we go back to our HTML, go back to that file, we can see that the code is still working. So now let's run that code through ngmin. Okay, let's look at what the ngmin has done. Looking here, you can see that ngmin didn't really do anything. It's still using the same reference to the controller, but if you look up at the controller, it hasn't been turned into a min-safed array. So this is a place where ngmin doesn't understand that this function is actually an injectable function and it needs to be min-safed. So you'll need to be careful when using ngmin that you avoid situations like this. So now that we understand what minification is and how it affects Angular, let's talk about the best practices for minification with Angular. So our first option is that we just don't minify at all. This is a very viable option. There's no requirement that says that you have to minify. It will make your code smaller and it will make your application perform better. But for a lot of applications, those benefits just aren't going to be that significant because you're just not moving that much code across the wire. Option 2 is to just manually min-safe your code. I demonstrated doing this in the demo. It's really not that difficult to do. You just have to remember to do it everywhere that you are using a function that has an injectable set of parameters. Option 3 is to use ngmin before you minify your code. And option 4 is to actually not mangle the parameter names in your minification process. There's a lot of minifiers out there that allow you to set settings as to what it minifies when it does its minification process. And one of those settings is the parameter names. So you can tell your minifier not to mangle your parameter names and leave them alone. A word of caution about this is that a lot of the space savings that you get out of minifying code comes from mangling the parameter names. You can remove 10 pieces of white space, and that looks like you've done a lot, but it really hasn't done very much. Whereas you can replace one identifier that's 5 characters long if it's used twice, and that gives you the same amount of space savings as removing 10 new line characters. Now let's review with a quiz. What are the two main benefits of minification? The two main benefits of minification are size and obscurity. What are the two main methods of minifying code? The two main methods of minifying code are removing white space and renaming variables and parameters. ngmin will minify your code safely, true or false. This is false. There are a few places where ngmin will miss code that it needs to min-safe, so you're going to have to be diligent if you're planning on using ngmin.